If you want to understand how societies shift without revolutions, don't just watch elections or wars. Watch what happens when people start owing each other slowly, repeatedly, and at scale. Because obligation is never only financial. Over time, it becomes leverage, and that leverage can quietly redraw the social map without anyone ever announcing that it's happening. We usually treat debt as an economic tool, an agreement that moves money forward in time. A loan, a repayment plan. A transaction that, in theory, ends when the last payment clears. And that framing isn't wrong, it's just incomplete, because historically, debt has rarely stayed inside the boundaries of economics. In many places and across many centuries, debt operated like a social technology. It created obligations that could be tracked, enforced, traded, inherited, and most importantly, used. Not always dramatically, often quietly. Debt made certain promises feel normal. It made certain hierarchies feel deserved. It gave some people a way to turn surplus into influence and influence into something that looked like stability. And what's interesting isn't that lenders wanted power. It's that given the incentives, power is simply what debt tends to produce, especially when rules, institutions, and social norms begin to organize around repayment. So rather than asking whether debt is good or bad, a calmer question might be more useful. When debt becomes common, what does it slowly teach people to accept about who owes whom and who gets to set the terms? To see how debt reshapes social structure, it helps to step into the mental world people lived inside, because older societies didn't treat obligation as an abstract concept. In medieval Europe, a large portion of daily life ran through layered duties: service, rent, labor, protection, and status. Many of these weren't debts in the modern paperwork sense, but they were obligations, expected, enforceable, and tied to one's place in the social order. Over time, some of those obligations began to shift. In many regions, labor services and dues could be commuted into money payments. That monetization mattered because once obligations become money-denominated, they become more easily counted, compared, transferred, and enforced in standardized ways. And standardized obligations are easier to scale than personal ones. One reason sovereign borrowing expanded was the decline of feudal military obligations and the rise of paid soldiers. Armies for hire needed cash reliably at scale. Then moving into the Renaissance, especially in places like the Italian city-states, you get a different environment. Dense trade networks, banking houses, public debts, and increasingly sophisticated credit arrangements. Here, debt wasn't merely a private matter, it became an institutional ecosystem. For example, Renaissance governments financed themselves in ways that pulled large portions of the citizenry into the role of creditor, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes through forced loans assessed by fiscal records. Over time, some city-states consolidated short-term loans into longer-term public debt and allowed those claims to become negotiable, meaning they could be bought and sold. That created secondary markets and widened participation across social groups, including artisans, through brokers and middlemen. This is where the mental landscape shifts. Debt starts looking less like an emergency measure and more like a normal way society coordinates risk, time, and control. When obligations are standardized and tradable, people can hold claims on each other without needing closeness or community. Credit becomes less personal, more system-like, less about trust between neighbors, more about trust in enforcement and records. And for lenders, the incentives become clear. Lending isn't only profitable. Lending is a way to gain security because someone owing you something is different from someone simply knowing you. Debt becomes a quiet instrument of influence. Imagine a society where wealth isn't yet fully financialized in the modern sense, where status comes from land, offices, guild standing, or noble ties. In that kind of world, lending can do something subtle. It lets people convert wealth into a claim that travels across social boundaries. And that's one of the key moments in the rise of creditor classes. The discovery that debt is not only an exchange but a position. Not a title, not an army, not even necessarily land. A position. In Renaissance Italy, governments often needed money quickly, especially for war and state building. Early borrowing could start with requests to wealthy citizens and evolve into broader systems, including forced loans based on wealth assessments. The important shift here is not just that governments borrowed, but that borrowing pulled more people into a structured relationship with the state, and with each other, through official records of who was owed what. Once a state consolidates and institutionalizes debt, it can turn into an asset people hold. And assets do something psychologically powerful. They turn patience into strategy. A person holding government debt doesn't just want repayment, they may want predictability, stable rules, and decision makers who treat creditors as central. Now take that logic and place it in a real human environment. A merchant with surplus wealth faces choices. Invest in goods that can be lost at sea. Invest in land that can be politically contested. Or lend privately or publicly, creating claims that can be enforced through courts and institutions. Lending becomes a way to reduce uncertainty. From the lender's perspective, it's not necessarily greed. It's risk management. It's a desire to make tomorrow less fragile than today. But that's where human motivation meets unintended social outcomes. Because once enough people treat lending as the safer path, the social world begins to tilt toward those who can issue credit, and away from those who must rely on it. In some Italian city-states, public debt markets became lively. Bonds circulated widely, transactions involved middlemen, and credits could be used in many social functions, paying taxes, forming dowries, making purchases, offering guarantees. In other words, debt claims started behaving like a connective tissue across society, not merely a state finance tool. When an asset becomes connective tissue, it quietly changes what counts as serious social standing. You're not only respected because you produce or fight or inherit. You're respected because you hold claims, and claims can be aggregated. If a small artisan is forced, directly or indirectly, into a system where taxes, payments, and emergencies require credit, then their life becomes more sensitive to lenders' terms. Meanwhile, people with surplus can spread risk across many borrowers, many bonds, many claims. This is the structural edge: diversification of risk for creditors, concentration of vulnerability for debtors. And it doesn't need malice to work. It only needs repetition. Over time, a creditor class can form even without a formal class identity. It forms through habits. Lending as a default use of surplus. Treating repayment reliability as moral reliability. Building institutions that preserve creditor confidence. That last part is crucial. Because as sovereign debt grows historically, governments often borrow for war and state survival. As feudal military obligations decline, rulers rely on cash to pay soldiers and fund campaigns. The state becomes more dependent on credit, and therefore more sensitive to the preferences of those who supply it. Now shift to private life again. In later centuries, especially with expanding consumer finance, we can see a comparable psychological transition. Credit moving from personal local trust to impersonal systems, records, bureaus, standardized approvals. The Boston Fed's historical overview notes how earlier credit was local and relational, then gradually became less personal as commerce scaled, culminating in modern credit systems where approval can happen without human familiarity. The parallel is not that Renaissance Florence had credit cards. It's that the social logic is similar. Once credit systems become scalable and less personal, the people who control the channels of credit can gain influence without needing to be socially intimate. And that influence tends to spread into institutions. Courts that define enforceable obligations. Governments that protect creditor trust. Cultural norms that equate repayment with virtue. At the same time, debt at the bottom can become sticky. Not always in the extreme form of bondage, but historically, debt has repeatedly been used to limit autonomy by tying people to landowners or employers. Even in much later contexts like post-Civil War sharecropping in the American South, the pattern shows how owed can become stuck with legal and economic constraints that made leaving difficult until the debt was paid. Britannica. That's a blunt example, but it highlights the quiet mechanism. Obligation can narrow options. So what happens socially as this repeats? A widening divide doesn't always look like dramatic poverty versus wealth. Often it looks like one group having room to breathe, and another group living inside compounding constraints. Creditors gain optionality, debtors lose it, and optionality quietly is a form of power. The unintended outcome is that social lines harden, not because everyone chooses hierarchy consciously, but because systems of obligation make some lives more flexible than others. So a creditor class rises not only as an economic group, but as a social group whose preferences start to matter. Stability over disruption. Enforceability over forgiveness. Predictability over improvisation. And once those preferences become embedded in institutions, they don't feel like preferences anymore. They feel like normal. There's a pattern here that shows up across settings, even when the surface details differ. People tend to use obligation as leverage, not necessarily as cruelty, often as assurance. Because if you've ever been uncertain about the future, you understand why a claim on someone else's future can feel stabilizing. This is the quiet psychological core. If I lend, I reduce my uncertainty. If you borrow, you temporarily reduce yours, but you accept a constraint later. And if this happens repeatedly across a society, the people with surplus become the people with claims. Over time, claims become a substitute for other forms of control. Instead of constant negotiation, you have contracts. Instead of personal persuasion, you have enforcement. Instead of fragile trust, you have systems. And that can be genuinely useful. It can lower transaction costs, enable investment, and build infrastructure. But it also creates a predictable social temptation. Once a society builds strong enforcement, the holders of enforceable claims tend to gain influence because they become central to how stability is maintained. In Renaissance city-states, you can see gradual power shifts around public credit. Public debt becomes institutionalized, secondary markets form, claims circulate, and bondholding spreads across social environments. Yet at the same time, the distribution of those claims can become highly concentrated, and the ability to trade and speculate tends to favor those with better access and more capital. Pezzolo, 2007. This is not an accusation, it's a human pattern, if you can. Wait longer. Absorb volatility. Buy undervalued claims, you can turn other people's urgency into your advantage. And because the mechanism is gradual, it often looks like mere competence. Another recurring pattern is that as credit systems scale, they become less personal, and that changes social behavior. The Boston Fed history of consumer credit emphasizes how earlier lending was local and personal, then gradually became less personal as commerce expanded, leading toward modern systems where decisions are made by records rather than relationships. When obligation becomes less personal, it becomes easier to enforce without empathy and also easier to hold without intimacy. That's a subtle shift, but it matters socially. You can be a good debtor without being known, and you can be excluded without anyone needing to dislike you. The leverage becomes procedural. And historically, power shifts often happen through procedure more than confrontation. Even sovereign borrowing shows a version of this. The state borrows for war, state building, public goods. Debt structures and ownership patterns change across time, and the ability to manage debt becomes tied to political conditions and who holds the claims. So the human nature pattern is people become evil. It's people respond to incentives. And once a society builds a reliable system for translating obligation into enforceable claims, many people will use it, especially those trying to protect themselves from uncertainty. The long-term social effect is that obligation becomes a quiet organizing principle. Who must prove reliability, who gets to demand it, who can walk away and who can't. Those questions create social structure even when no one says they're doing it. If we keep the lens observational and resist forcing a simple moral, some later periods show similar responses when credit expands. For example, in the United States, installment credit and broader consumer finance grew dramatically in the early 20th century. A historical overview of the 1920s notes installment credit soaring, widespread buying on time, and a cultural transition towards spending and borrowing as part of consumer life. That isn't the Renaissance, but the social echoes are familiar, as credit becomes normal. More people can access goods earlier, but more people also become legible to systems that evaluate repayment. And social pressure adjusts around what normal ownership looks like. Similarly, the Boston Fed credit history describes how definitions of luxury shift over generations and how credit access changes consumption norms. What once looked frivolous becomes ordinary, and credit becomes embedded in daily life. In those expansions, you can observe the same quiet social dynamic. Obligations accumulate across households. Repayment becomes a measure of trustworthiness. And financial institutions gain a kind of soft governance role by setting terms, standards, and eligibility. Again, observational parallels only, but they help us see that debt's social effect is not confined to one era. Whenever obligation becomes widespread, standardized, and enforceable at scale, it tends to do more than move money. It reorganizes relationships. So if we return to the opening idea, that debt is often treated as purely economic. The historical record suggests a gentler correction. Debt is an economic tool that behaves like a social force, not because anyone announces it, but because humans treat obligation as meaningful. We remember who helped us. We remember who we owe. And when systems make those obligations transferable and enforceable, they become something bigger than personal memory. They become structured. Over centuries, creditor classes didn't rise only because money grew more important. They rose because debt made influence portable, because claims on the future can be held, traded, protected, and leveraged. And if there's a lingering thought worth sitting with, it's not a warning, just an observation. Debt quietly redraws social lines. If you want more calm, human-centered history like this, focused on incentives, power, and unintended shifts, you can subscribe. And if you're curious, tell me in the comments, where do you think obligation shapes behavior most today, family, work, or institutions?